categories. I'll go through each of them in turn. So basically all species on the planet, all species apart from microorganisms, so we don't assess viruses, we don't assess bacteria. Believe me, people have asked us to do that. I don't know why, but they have. But all species on the planet can be put into one of the 9 IUCN Red List categories. At the moment, very sadly, most of the species on the planet fall into not evaluated, which basically means we haven't even had a chance to look to see if any information is available on that species. Nobody has looked to see if those species are extinct or threatened or quite safe at the moment. So we have no idea what's going on there because nobody has looked to see. Usually it's because there isn't enough funding available for somebody to go out and gather the data. Sometimes it's because nobody has really studied the animal or plant, so they don't really know what's happening. So that's the not evaluated species. Of the evaluated species, at the moment there are over 63,000 species that have been evaluated for a Red List category. So they're published on the IUCN Red List at the moment. There's another several thousand on their way to us, and another several thousand, well, not several thousand, but a few hundred that are with us, ready for updating, for being published in the next update as well. So the evaluated species, many of those will be data deficient. And by data deficient, we mean somebody has actually looked at the available information for that species, but there is insufficient information or insufficient information of the correct type to be able to assess the extinction risk of the species. So we've tried, but really we don't know. It could be anything between extinct and list concern. So we really don't know. Then you come to the species which have adequate data. So you've got information, and there is some information on population trends, habitat, ecology, threats, and enough to at least be able to give an estimate of the risk of extinction for that species. So some of those will be least concern, and least concern is it's an odd category. A lot of people assume that least concern means no conservation priority required. That's not what it means. You have to always remember we're looking at extinction risk here. We're not looking at conservation prioritization list. Least concern means that the species has a very, very, very low risk of becoming extinct in the near future. It usually applies to the safe species. It usually applies to widespread, abundant, maybe increasing, maybe species that are actually a problem in some parts of the world because they've been introduced in other countries and they're causing problems for other species. Or just your common birds, your common mammals, your common plants that you see every day, they're least concern. It can also be used for the situation where you have a species that is very widespread, but there is evidence that the population is actually gradually declining. But it's declining at such a low rate that the IUCN criteria don't pick up on that decline. So there are actually some species sitting in least concern that do actually merit some conservation attention, at least some monitoring to make sure that decline doesn't accelerate and push that species into a higher threat category. So those are the species that need to be flagged as a conservation, some kind of conservation action or attention is needed there. It may also apply to species that have a highly restricted range, but there are no threats affecting that species at all. So I'm thinking about things like island endemics, where the island itself might be extremely small and within the threatened thresholds, but the island is uninhabited, it's not visited, there's no risk as far as people know. That species just happens to have a restricted range and it's quite happily getting on with its life as it's done for many thousands of years before. We would not assess that species as threatened. If we did, then you would end up with lots of island endemic species assessed as threatened, and that doesn't really inform conservation at all. It just doesn't mean anything. So we would assess those species as least concern. If there was a threat, a plausible threat, so for example there were introduced species sort of gradually marching their way across, hopping from island to island, then you know that threat's coming along, then yes, that species would be at some risk. But we'll talk about that situation later on. Moving up towards the higher threatened categories, we have near threatened. Now, near threatened is a special case which doesn't have any criteria that apply to the near threatened category itself, but it basically means that the species is, you have enough information to know that most of the thresholds and the criteria are met for a threatened category, but not quite all of the criteria are met. So, for example, it might have a restricted range, it might have very few locations, but there's no continuing decline there. But you have some kind of concern in the background that it just takes one thing for that continuing decline to happen, and then that species can very rapidly move into one of the threatened categories. So it's sitting just outside threatened. Yeah.
I mean, it sounds, by the way you describe it, that it's kind of subjective.
Well, there is a certain decision to make here. In the user guidelines, we actually do give some examples of how far out of the thresholds you can be to actually meet that near threatened. So we're not talking about something that's like way out of the thresholds. But generally, if it meets 2 out of the 3 conditions, then it can be near threatened. Or if it's just outside the threshold, then it's near threatened. So there is a certain amount of subjectivity there, but then you have to remember the assessor makes that decision, and then reviewers look at the information and decide as well. So they judge it on its merits, and then in the record stream we look at it as well. So I mean, there's several stages before it gets published. So you know, the subjectivity is to a certain degree. The IUCN categories and criteria are not an exact science, as you clearly can see here, but it's basically the best way that we've got to estimate a general, it's quite a rough estimate of extinction risk for comparing species across all taxonomic groups in all regions. There's another condition for near threatened. You may have a situation where a species is actually quite stable. It appears to be fairly secure at the moment, but that's only because there's a very robust conservation action initiative in place to keep that species from being pushed into a threatened category. The classic example we always quote is the southern white rhino. So the population of southern white rhino is pretty stable, but that's purely because it's highly managed. If you take that conservation initiative away, then the poachers will almost definitely go in and push that species very rapidly towards extinction. It's been done before, we've seen it's been done, and poaching is a major problem again. It's accelerating again. So that kind of situation, the species can sit near threat for many, many years, even though the population is actually technically stable. Okay, now we move into the threatened categories. So all of these categories are categories of threat, but the 3 categories I'm showing you here, critically endangered, endangered and vulnerable, these are what we refer to as the threatened categories. So when IUCN talks about there being over 19,000 threatened species on the IUCN Red List, we're talking about species that fall into one of these 3 categories. Very generally, they're all threatened, they all mean threatened, but they're kind of threatened to slightly higher degrees as you move up the scale. So vulnerable is at severe risk of extinction in the wild in the near future, endangered is at even more risk, higher risk, and critically endangered is at extreme risk of becoming extinct in the near future if things carry on the way they are. These are the categories that the criteria thresholds apply to. So the criteria kind of filter your data to direct your species into one of these three categories. And if the thresholds are not met, you're then having to actually decide, is it so far out of the thresholds that this is actually least concern, or is it close enough to be near threatened? Or is it actually the other extreme, is it actually going, is it extinct, basically? We have this additional flag, which is why we've just actually displayed it as a flag. It's not a category itself. It's a tag that we attach to the critically endangered category. This is used for species where it's called possibly extinct. It's used for species where all the evidence, or most of the evidence we've got to date, suggests that in all likelihood this species is actually probably extinct by now. But there hasn't quite been enough survey work done, so there's a possibility that it may actually occur in some unsurveyed area that we're planning to visit in the near future or over the coming years. We brought this flag in to basically declaring something as being extinct is a huge step. It's signing the death warrant on any conservation funding going into that, finding that species and doing research on it. So you have to be sure that enough survey work has been done across the historic range, across the potential habitat where the species could occur, to finally say, okay, we haven't seen it for 50, 60, 30, however many years, but we've also been doing survey work over that time and we've been pointedly looking for it and can't find it. It's likely extinct now, so then you would declare it extinct. Until then, it could sit in the critically endangered, possibly extinct category. It's a very good communication tool, possibly extinct, because you can quote the figures for extinct and extinct in the wild, and people look at it and say, oh, wow, that's high, but hey, I've heard that we're losing 20,000 species a year, etc. And so, well, at the moment, actually on the red list, there are over 400 critically endangered, possibly extinct species flagged, which is quite a considerable chunk to add on to the extinct figures. So we're moving up to the doom and gloom categories. Extinct in the wild is what it says on the label. It means that the species no longer, as far as we know, occurs in the wild. It only occurs in captivity or in herbariums. So the last individuals you can go and see in a botanic garden or in a zoo, basically. And extinct is the worst case scenario. I've already explained how we get there. You have to do repeated surveys in suitable habitat within the known range of the species and within potential range of the species. You only do the best you can and then declare it extinct. That's a situation we don't want to get to. On the red list, we have been accused in the past, well, not accused, but labelled in the past as being people who have the most depressing job on the planet. But actually I don't see it that way. I see it as actually quite a positive job, because what we're trying to do is push things away from that category and away from the threatened categories and down to least concern. If everything was least concern, it would be great, and I could go and do another job and not count threatened species for the rest of my life. I've mentioned this before. The red list is not a static document. It changes over time. Species are assessed and then reassessed and then reassessed and then reassessed, depending on what new data come out. The research is constantly going on, new information comes along, new technologies come along that allow you to gather data more efficiently and remotely, and really improve our knowledge on the status of species out in the wild. So there are lots of different reasons why a species may change category over time. By far, what we see is the most common reason on the red list for species changing status at the moment is because new information becomes available. It's a non-genuine change. It's just basically a refinement of what we know about the species. So we highlight that reason for change in the underlying database so we can see which species have genuinely changed and which have not genuinely changed. So there may be new information, there may be taxonomic changes, so species, taxonomists, are any of you taxonomists? okay, I can clearly say that what I'm going to say now. Taxonomists can be a pain in the neck. They're constantly changing the goalposts. They split species, they merge species, they shout at each other for not recognising the same name, the same concept. Things change, and that can change the status of a species. It may keep the same name, but it might not actually be the same concept as it was before. So before it was least concern, now it's been split into 200 new species, and suddenly it's critically endangered. It's not actually the same thing that's being assessed. Sometimes we have incorrect data being used in an assessment unknowingly, so perhaps that might be related to identification of the species. It's a misidentification of incorrect data being assigned to that species. The fourth point here, criteria revision. This is becoming less common now that we're using this version of the criteria. It was very common in the early 2000s or early noughties. When we were switching between versions, because some of the criteria thresholds changed. So some of the reassessments changed category because, not that the species had changed at all or the information had changed at all, it's just that the thresholds had changed, so it had to move to a different category. But that's becoming less common now. And sometimes it's purely because the assessor before didn't have a good knowledge of the criteria. So we're actually correcting the assessment. And then we get to the genuine status changes, which are the ones that we really want to focus on for doing things like the Red List Index and monitoring the change in status of biodiversity over time. So these are the things that are genuinely getting worse and moving towards extinction, or genuinely improving. We want to know about the good news stories as well. That's after all why we're doing all of this. We want things to genuinely improve. Yes.
The change is happening because there is a reassessment.
Sorry?
The change is happening because there is a reassessment or someone pointing out that it's...
Oh, it can be both. Often it's because there's a reassessment, so it's gone through a whole project. Sometimes it's because the assessors have actually gone out and done some more research over the next year, and they come back to us and say, actually we've got new information now, so they volunteer to do the reassessment, so they don't have to wait for a new project. And sometimes somebody contacts the Red List unit and says, oh, I read this assessment on the Red List. I've actually got some information here that from my PhD that I finished last year, and it says this. So we then put that person in touch with the assessors and they discuss it and reassess it. So it comes from a whole variety of backgrounds. Okay, the issue of data quality, which Michael, you raised, and data uncertainty as well. Clearly, we cannot have top-class information about every single species on the planet. Very rarely do we have lots of really good information. Most of the time, we're dealing with species that are relatively unknown. So, IUCN, we live in the real world as well. We're not going to accept an assessment without top-class quantitative data and published references for absolutely every point within the assessment. If we did that, nothing would be assessed, and we'd be back to square one, really. So the threatened categories use the quantitative thresholds. So they are kind of based around the premise that you have data. In the ideal world, you would have data that would slot things neatly into these thresholds. But we do understand that that's not always the case. So we allow this flexibility in the quality of data. The main thing we require, though, is that the assessment be properly documented. There's information included to explain what the quality of the data are, what the assumptions are in the assessment, so where you're inferring something, where you're assuming that this must be happening because this is happening elsewhere. So be very clear in the documentation, and it'll be fine, we'll accept that. Now on the on the criteria summary sheet, this thing here, you will notice that there are various terms which relate to the quality of the data. So we talk about observed information, estimated, inferred, projected, or suspected. Now, these terms are dotted throughout the whole of that sheet. But what do they mean? Okay, this is an important point, but I don't want you to dwell too much on it and get too paranoid about whether something is inferred or suspected or estimated or inferred. As long as you've got a broad idea of what we're talking about here, the whole point is that we can have, sorry, I'm running over time obviously, that we can have various types of data that can be used in the assessment. So you can have observed information, and this is top class. This is where you have observed what is happening to every single individual in the population. You will almost never have this unless your species is really in a bad way and you can actually look at every single individual. So here's an example. Imagine